Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I've got another really interesting guest for you to meet. He's a really interesting man. He published his first novel back in 2007, a book called The Unreals. He's working on a children's story at the moment, non-fiction works as well. He began looking into the JFK assassination back in the mid-1970s. And of course, we all know how important it is what happened to JFK and how it was covered up. He's just he's promoting a book at the moment, which he was kind enough to send me a copy of, and I've been reading through it as quickly as I can. It's a terrific book. It's called Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies and cover-ups in American politics. It was recommended to me, and he was recommended to me by our friend Cynthia McKinney, the former Georgia Congresswoman. He's in Virginia, just outside of DC. Let's welcome to the programme Don Jeffries. Don, you're very welcome. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute honour. Great to be with you. Love this sort of stuff. Glad that people are writing about this, Don. So it's an encyclopedia then. It's almost like a starting point for people getting or finding their way into discovering what it is that governments and politicians and corporations are capable of doing. Is that what motivated you to write this book, Don?
Yeah, well, I've been looking into this stuff for a long time, starting with the JFK assassination. And it's odd you mentioned encyclopedia because that was the original subtitle instead of expose. It was an encyclopedia because I think it does have that kind of quality about it where, you know, you can kind of start wherever you want. And if you want to pick and choose between the subjects, you don't necessarily have to read it from beginning to end. And a lot of people who've read it have told me that. They just latched onto something that caught their attention first and kind of, backtracked and read whatever they wanted in whatever order they wanted.
Don, did what happened to JFK and the manner in with which that was covered up and the levels at which it was covered up, did that change your worldview as a young man?
Oh, it certainly did. I was only 7 when JFK was assassinated, but it still had a tremendous impact on me and the entire country. We were a Catholic family. He was the first Catholic president, and my family certainly was overwhelmed by it. And that's one of my first memories was watching the nonstop coverage of the funeral. And when Oswald was shot like that on live TV, even as a little kid, you know, I understood that, you know, Jack Ruby must have shot him to shut him up. I mean, even as a 7-year-old, apparently I had more sophistication than mainstream journalists here have because they don't seem to be able to grasp that concept. But yeah, it certainly did change me. When I started really reading the critical books later as a teenager, and obviously when I got into my 20s, I was devouring everything I could on the subject. It made me look into other subjects because I realized once I found that here we had a president of the United States that was shot in broad daylight, and all of our institutions, as the critic Harold Weisberg used to say, all our major institutions failed at that time. The media did not do its job. Really opened my eyes about the media. And if there's a subtext in my book, it's how awful our mainstream media is and how all these stories exist and they don't do any investigative reporting. And it really became glaringly obvious after the Kennedy assassination because they just didn't ask any questions. NBC News early on agreed officially. There's a memo out there you can find where they agreed to cover only aspects of the story that was in consonance with the FBI's version of events. So early on, they were not about to ask any questions about, you know, one of the crimes of the century. And once I realized they could do that, I don't think anything could be put past them. And obviously, when I started investigating things like 9/11 and on down the line, you see the same kind of things in each one of these cases.
One of these days, Don, somebody with the motivation, I think, is going to look into, it might have to be a medical professional, maybe somebody who's worked in psychiatry, maybe. I'd love somebody to look into the subconscious effects and the changes that young men, I mean, you were a young man when it happened, but then you got into your teens and your late teens and you started looking into Kennedy. And there must be a real subconscious, profound effect on somebody when they start to realise that everything they ever held sacred, you know, that your elected officials and your government and your police force, they're there looking out for your best interests. When you start to think about these things, of course, you find out that's not entirely true. That must have some sort of effect on us, Don. It must do. I don't know if it's something you've ever considered. It changes us, I think. It does something to us. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure does. It certainly doesn't make you popular at parties or among your friends and
No,
family.
no.
I can tell you that. But yeah, it really does. It makes you cynical. It can make you bitter. I try to laugh at it as much as I can, but yeah, I mean, things like even voting. I mean, I vote most of the time, even though there's almost no one to vote for ever. I wasn't in Cynthia McKinney's district. I would have voted for her, but very very few people out there worth voting for that have any chance of winning. But and you can see in my book, I go through the vote scam thing where I'm pretty well convinced that most, if not all, of the voting process is rigged, or at least to some degree. And I think that vote scam proved that. So, but I still go through the emotions because I figure, okay, I'm going to do my civic duty, and who knows? I can't definitively prove that, but yeah, you and the same thing with the media, where if you realize the media aren't going to report these things, what I've done is I've tuned out of what I call the dinosaur. A lot of people call the dinosaur media. I don't watch television news. I mean, I just absolutely can't stand it. I feel brain cells dying when it comes on. I mean, it's so awful. And luckily there's more and more shows out there like yours that are presenting an alternative view and giving. I mean, someone like me couldn't get on Fox News or MSNBC or anything like that. And so it gives voices like mine that are out there that are coming at things from a different perspective. I mean, everything I describe in the book has been covered, and it's in history books, but it's not necessarily maybe literally hidden, but the interpretation I have on it, I think, is logical. I mean, I'm just assessing the facts, and people always talk about conspiracy theories, and I don't have a theory. I mean, if anybody can find a theory in my book, let me know what it is. I don't know what it is because I'm just assessing events. And what happens is these official narratives from the JFK assassination to Oklahoma City to 9/11 to whatever you pick to Waco, any event you pick to choose, they don't hold water. When you look at them, they have holes in them. They just don't make any sense. And the wildest conspiracy theory usually makes at least as much sense, if not more sense, than the official narrative that they're trotting out there and expecting you to believe.
Loads and loads of emails and comments. Justine Hughes is listening. Justine, how are you? She says, Richie, ask Don, does he discount or does he like the idea that Marilyn Monroe's death had any connection to the JFK assassination? That's the question you probably expected. What do you think, Don?
Well, I didn't really go into it too much in the book, but I've certainly studied that. I don't think she killed herself. I think the record shows that she was murdered. I don't buy the fact that the Kennedys, because that's the inference is usually that the Kennedys did it. Bobby Kennedy was seen there that day and so forth. I believe her murder was a warning to JFK that it was something like, here's the most famous movie star in the world. We're going to knock her off and, you're next. And obviously, I guess he didn't heed that warning. But I don't. Clearly, the official story of her death, and there again, I don't want to go into it too deeply here, and I don't have all that information.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot of doubt, regarding the autopsy report and the maid that was there and the arrival of the police. I mean, a lot of it doesn't make any sense, and clearly, I don't think she killed herself. But why? Who killed her? I mean, a lot of these times we can't really point our fingers exactly at who it was, but it's kind of, again, what I call a system of organized corruption. And, I think that's just a way of doing business. And she was playing with some very powerful people. Whether or not she was having an affair with one or both Kennedys, she certainly at least had some kind of relationship, I think, there. So,
do you know what's really annoying, Don? Is that very aspect of the whole thing is used to try and shut guys like you up. They always say, well, who did it then? And Don Jeffries or Jim Marr, it's not your job to find out who did it. You're entitled to say, well, excuse me, the narrative you presented us doesn't make too much sense. But they always throw that at guys like you. Well, who did it then? Who did it then, wise guy? Right. Give me a break here. I don't know who did it. I always say that about 9/11. I don't know who perpetrated it, but I know for a fact it wasn't 19 guys with box cutters. But I don't know who did do it. Yeah, that's right. It's incredible. On JFK, Alex tweets in this, loads of tweets coming in. This is good stuff, folks. 21 minutes past the hour. The author, Donald Jeffries, on the line to us from Virginia. Great to have him on. Alex says, Richie, please put it to... where's it gone, that tweet now? It was about whether or not the JFK autopsy was done using a body double of some description. I've lost that tweet now, but it was about that. That was basically the gist of it. Oh yeah, is it true that there was a body double for the autopsy photos? Any evidence supporting that?
Well, I think the autopsy, I don't know about a body double, but the autopsy photos and x-rays, I believe, are certainly not legitimate. I mean, we know at Parkland Hospital, the people who originally examined JFK after the shooting, that every single medical personnel there, doctors and nurses both, described a massive blowout of the back of the head. And the autopsy photos, the official photos that we see, show an intact back of the head. Yeah. So either every one of those doctors and nurses envisioned the exact same thing that was completely false, or that's the problem with that autopsy. Everything about it is, as Harold Weisberg, again, to mention him again, he was fond of saying that President Kennedy didn't get an autopsy worthy of a Bowery bum. And he was exactly right. It was an awful autopsy. It was done by people who weren't qualified to do it. Questions abound about every aspect of it, down to the brain, which has been lost for posterity. Nobody knows where it was. And the best evidence indicates that it was destroyed in a food processor by a Secret Service agent.
Imagine that.
You can't make this stuff up. It's not an Onion story.
No, it's terrible. JP was on to say, we love this theory, not because it excites us, but because we know what these people are capable of. What about links to the Bush family and George H.W. Bush being groomed for becoming the CIA head at the time of the assassination? Now, it's important to remind our listeners, Don was 7 years old, and Don remembers where he was when he heard the news. Don's parents, and I don't know if they're still alive, I hope they are, but if they are, they will remember where they were. The only man in the world who was alive when JFK was murdered, who says he hasn't a clue where he was, is George H.W. Bush. I don't buy that, Don. You cannot believe that. But he looks people in the eye and he tells them that without blinking. What do you think?
Yeah, well, and there's an infamous memo, George Bush of the CIA, that was written at that time that's come out, and they're photographs. There's so much photographic controversy here, and I don't get into it too much because it's you can argue about what you're seeing in shadowy photos, but I know there's at least one photo that people think was George H.W. Bush. It was in Dealey Plaza that day. And I look at it like, the Bush family is certainly a criminal family, like the Clintons and the Roosevelts and so forth, the Rockefellers that have been around for a long time. And I don't put anything past them, but I think that the powers that we're talking about probably run above them. I believe George H.W. Bush was, manipulated and groomed into the position he became, just like his son George W. Bush was. And apparently they failed and tempted and to have Jeb Bush cede to the throne after him, but I think they're stronger powers above them, and so I wouldn't. I look away from people that say things like, Bush was behind the assassination, or Nixon, or even LBJ. I mean, I go into great detail about LBJ's behavior, and I think he certainly knew it was going to happen and was happy about it. But I think that the people that actually organized this and orchestrated it are unknown to most of the public.
I just got to mention this. You may not have seen this, so you probably won't have a comment on it. You may have seen it. The Daily Mail newspaper ran a story yesterday. That's Britain's biggest tabloid newspaper. And it's a physicist. The story is about a physicist who's run basically a kind of a scientific experiment. And he basically says that all of the things that we discuss on this programme, Don, and that you discuss, that basically none of this could be possible because this guy is calculated using this kind of bizarre model that too many people would have had to know in all these conspiracies. So whether it's about JFK, whether it's about 9/11, whether it's about vaccines, this guy is basically saying it's impossible to keep anything secret. Therefore, all these conspiracies are ludicrous. What? Now I know what I would say to that. What do you say to that?
Well, that's the mantra. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a journalist, whether they're interviewed on C-SPAN or programs like that when they're left to their own devices, or a politician, or in this case the UK Daily Mail. That's the mantra there, is that you can't keep a secret in Washington, D.C. Too many people would have had to be involved. Someone would have talked. There was even a book called Someone Would Have Talked. And the problem that most of us know that have researched this is plenty of people have talked. A lot of them are dead. A lot of them died unnaturally. But the problem is no one's listening. If someone came forward, and you have plenty of people that came forward and said, I was on the grassy knoll and so forth, and most of them are ridiculous. But even if someone could legitimately come forward, the mainstream media, there's no one for them to talk to except people like us. And then we're crazy conspiracy theorists, so no, we don't have any credibility in the mainstream.
But of course, what's incredible is how successful some of these programs are beginning to become. I've never boasted, I've never bragged, but our program is amongst the most listened to nightly programs on any platform in the UK every night of the week. We've over 40,000 listeners to the live show. The podcast is the number one podcast in news and current affairs on Podomatic. We get 20,000 downloads a week of the podcast of the live show. So it doesn't matter what they do to prevent this information getting out there. There are programs now doing well. And basically what we're doing is we're mirroring the mainstream media. We're applying the standards of the mainstream media to programs like this, making them sexy. But the difference being is that we're getting, credible men and women on like you who've got things to say. And ultimately it's going to be their undoing, Don. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Using the internet, this program goes out on commercial radio as well as on online radio stations. That's how we're going to beat these lunatics. Just before we move on to Timothy McVeigh, which we want to talk about, a couple of people have asked me. Sean was on to say, what about William Cooper, the driver? I'm always interested in this. A great friend of ours, Jim Mars, who you know very well. Jim's been on the programme with me. He's been on programmes with me going back 10 years now. Jim discounts the idea that the driver shot him in the face. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, again, that's one of those theories that are trotted out there to make, and it tends to make us look even wackier than they want to have us look. I accuse William Greer of quite a bit in my book. He was the driver, and I believe he was probably complicit in some way. He certainly didn't act the way a trained professional should have acted in that situation. But I really think that this plot was sophisticated enough that they would have had something a little more legitimate than having the driver turn around and shoot him. I mean, It just, whether or not people were, they could be distracted, I guess, in that situation. But I understand it. Again, it's because of the quality of the Zapruder film. And there's a whole school of thought that all argues that the Zapruder film was altered. And, it has a cartoonish quality to it. Some of it does. And, again, the film went through the same hands that all the other evidence did. So who knows how much of it is trustworthy. But I really tend to discount the idea that the conspirators decided to employ an older gentleman who was driving this. I mean, they certainly could employ him to not do his job, as they all stood down that day. But to have him be the shooter, I find that a little hard to believe.
If you're just joining the program, 29 minutes past the hour. My guest this hour is Donald Jeffries. It's great to have Donald on the program. He's talking to us from Virginia, just outside DC. What an interesting place for him to be, of course, with considering what we're talking about. We've touched on JFK. We've touched on elections being rigged in the United States. We could probably spend hours talking about Catherine Harris and Texas companies wiping African Americans off the rolls in Florida and how they got away with it, Don. when you think about it, here we are in 2016 and these bastards, none of them has done time for basically disenfranchising and committing one of the most racist acts ever committed in recent times against a whole body of people. We're taking your name off the roll because you might vote for the other guy.
Yeah, yes. Well, voting fraud is rampant. Like I said, you see vote scam. When the Collier brothers went to, I believe it was the University of Miami, where anyway, the guy, they found the programmer who was writing these projection programs or something, and they just had a question, and it was like a science. So much of this has a science fiction quality movie about it. And the guy just said to them, "You'll never prove a thing." That's how he greeted them. I mean, it's you can't write this stuff up, and that's so it doesn't surprise me. What happened to Florida in 2000 was really the kind of stuff that, and in the same area of the world. I mean, the Collier brothers were from Dade County, and Janet Reno at the time was the district attorney of Dade County, and she helped cover it up before she later became attorney general.
It's a mad world, Don. We've been reporting on this program in recent weeks that government ministers in Britain are walking out of politics and they are walking into corporations whom they have legislated on or for in their time in office. It's unbelievable. The revolving door is right there in front of people's eyes if they want to look at it. To be fair to the mainstream media, they're even doing these articles saying, look, this woman used to work at the Department of Health or somewhere like that. She's made decisions or been party to making decisions that have benefited a certain company. She's now working for them.
Well, we certainly have that all over here. I mean, you go back to when the deadly artificial sweetener, a NutraSweet, was approved by the FDA back. Again, Donald Rumsfeld was all involved in that.
That's right. G.K. Searle, yeah.
And, we've had that revolving door in many ways. And over here we have the revolving door in the media, too, where if you turn on television news, you're watching people like on ABC, George Stephanopoulos, how is he going to possibly comment on the Hillary Clinton's campaign?
Yeah. He worked for her husband for years. That's right. Got him elected, yeah.
You have Karl Rove over on Fox, that was a Republican head. So they're not professional journalists, and even the ones that don't have that kind of background. Chris Matthews, for instance, he's a big time talking head. He was Tip O'Neill's chief of staff for many years, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and that's what you get. And this left and right paradigm, that's one of the things I talk about the most. Is that there's this left and right stuff is crazy, and it's it ends up being argument over issues like abortion and flag burning and stuff like that. That really doesn't affect people's lives. But on the big issues, they all agree. They all want more war all the time. They never find a war they don't like.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to give a quick plug again for the book. It's Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies and cover-ups in American politics. It's available on or at all good online retailers. Check out, I suppose you're going to check out amazon.com or .co.uk by Donald Jeffries. It's great. He was good enough to send me an electronic copy of it. I've been reading through it. It's great. It's a great resource of information. It really is. So the Oklahoma City bombing then, April the 19th, 1995, I was just about to begin my career in commercial radio. Never forget it because of the damage that it did. The Alfred P. Murrah building in downtown Oklahoma blown to pieces. Massive loss of life, 168 people killed, nearly 700 people injured. Eventually, we found out that Timothy McVeigh planned it with Terry Nichols. McVeigh was eventually executed for it. Nichols, as far as I know, is still in prison, and that's where he'll remain for the rest of his life, in a federal prison. But looking into it over the years and talking to people, particularly people like Jesse Trentadue, who's been on this program many times, he's a Utah-based attorney whose brother was beaten to death in federal custody, Kenneth Trentadue, because he looked like possibly John Doe, a guy who was supposed to be involved in the bombing. How would you sum up the problems with the Oklahoma City bombing official story, Don?
Boy, where do we start? Well, it certainly came at a very opportune moment for Bill Clinton and the rest of the government at that time, because we were just fresh off Ross Perot's first campaign, the first independent campaign that really drew attention. And if he hadn't had that mysterious dropping out in the middle of the race, only to come back, he still got 19% of the vote, which was the largest anybody had gotten in a very long time. And there was a brewing third-party movement finally in this country. You had the militia movement on the right and so forth, and you always had the Ralph Nader types on the left that were kind of coalescing. And they were very anti-NAFTA, the free trade agreement that turned out to be so deadly for us. So what happened is this was a very opportune moment because Bill Clinton exploited this to the hilt afterwards. He blamed talk radio and he blamed those third-party movements, and it pretty much collapsed afterwards. And if you look at it, as I do in the book, I examine it in great detail. I mean, Timothy McVeigh was basically convicted on his beliefs. It was one of the first times it was glaring how, and I don't believe until that time they had allowed the victims' family members to testify, because of course they were witnesses to nothing other than their own tragedy. And certainly we feel for those people, but the law used to recognize that it was terribly prejudicial to have, family members getting up on the stand and weeping and influencing the jury. Well, in McVeigh's case, that's all they had. They didn't even introduce evidence that McVeigh was at the scene of the crime. There
was no evidence, wasn't? We must remind people that shortly after it happened, McVeigh was picked up for driving without a license plate. What a genius criminal he was then, eh? Driving without a license and for carrying a weapon unlawfully in the car. A few days later, Terry Nichols, his old army friend, is picked up, and basically it's pinned on them. And we were told that because of Ruby Ridge, which was a terrible thing. I recommend people check out what happened at Ruby Ridge, by the way. And Don goes into Waco as well in his book. Because of all of that, these guys were getting revenge. Simple as bada boom, bada bing, bang, they're guilty. Exactly. That was it, wasn't it?
Exactly, and that's pretty much what McVeigh was convicted for his beliefs. I mean, he was reading. At that time, I was a subscriber to the Spotlight newspaper, which was smeared as anti-Semitic, but it was the only thing before the internet, the only periodical out there where you were getting independent news and another view, and you had to kind of wade through the Mossad agent behind every tree and so forth that they tended to go with. But they did some good work. They were the first ones to expose the Bilderbergers, for instance. And, they talked about the Trilateral Commission, the CFR, and things like that. But these kind of things were introduced at his trial. His reading, I mean, all of us should shiver in fear to think that if we're on trial for something that they can start, introducing our reading material, saying, oh, this guy reads this, and the jury, was like many of these juries. They were easily persuaded. And McVeigh, as is the case in, going back to Bruno Richard Hoffman or Sirhan, James Earl Ray, they received terrible legal representation. Even the Boston bomber recently. Just awful legal representation. They don't really, they don't go over all the flaws and the holes in the case that we all can see out here, sitting in parents' basements or wherever we're sitting, we can see these things. It's so obvious to us, but these lawyers can't. And in McVeigh's case, as I said, they didn't introduce any evidence he was at the scene of the crime, and they couldn't because every single witness that placed him at the scene of the crime placed him with John Doe number 2. And John Doe number 2 went down the memory hole, and they, Janet Reno originally even mentioned John Doe number 2. They didn't want to introduce anybody else except for his hapless friend Nichols, who it's really, as you mentioned, he's in prison. It's really a travesty of justice because there's absolutely nothing to tie him to this bombing at all. But in this case, we didn't have a magic bullet as we had in the JFK assassination. We had a magic fertilizer bomb. And there's no way that possibly did all that damage. There's massive evidence of explosives being planted in there. The early, you can see videos online where the early coverage from Oklahoma television stations talk over and over again about these explosives. And you had people like General Ben Parton, one of the top demolition experts in the country, but he couldn't get it. We talk about someone would have talked. Well, here's the expert, the military's top expert in the country that was saying there had to be explosives, that fertilizer bomb couldn't have done it. He couldn't get any airtime on the mainstream television networks because there's no one to talk to. So,
do you know what, Don? Can I ask you a question based on that? So, if he'd have gotten on Fox or CNN to say that, do you think that people would want to believe it, Don? Because I have friends who sometimes listen to this program, but a lot of times they don't because they don't like it or what we talk about. People don't like this sort of stuff because it asks them too many questions they don't want to ask themselves. Do you think hearing from experts that there's no way is that the bomb could have, the fertilizer bomb in the truck could have brought down the building? Do you think even if that had been said on the news at the time, that people would have, stood up and said, listen, hang on, we're not happy with this? That's always a question that's always in my mind. What do you think?
Well, I think it would have certainly swayed public opinion to some extent because people still, and that's the problem we face now. I mean, radio shows like yours are drawing bigger listeners, and more and more young people are going to the internet and they're not watching television news. But there's still enough older people and people that are successful tend to, they're looking for the market update and so forth, see how their investments are doing. So they're trusting these old sources that we now find completely, incredible. But so I think it would have, I've always said, if we just had one honest television network still, if we had a television network that, if you had a television network, or these people had it, and you really presented alternative news, if Cynthia McKinney and people like that were the talking heads on television, just imagine, I think it would persuade people because most people really aren't that interested in politics. And, they're other than how it affects their own lives, maybe the economy and, trying to find a job and so forth. But most people aren't interested in it. And so they just kind of tend to go with what they hear. And that's the conventional view. But if they had, different kinds of talking heads that offered real different perspectives, I think that they would, and if they had seen a General Parton on there, or retired FBI agent Ted Gunderson, people like that were talking about these issues back then, I think that they would have looked at it differently. I don't know what would have happened because, other than revolting, I don't know how you can stop the government from doing what it's doing. But certainly, I think that public opinion would have been different.
I want to ask you one question about the motivations and what was the benefit of destroying the federal building in Oklahoma. Before I do, though, I want to acknowledge some more emails. Lawrence is listening to this in South Africa. Lawrence, how are you? Richie, the comment about people asking, well, who did it then, is similar to when you tell people about the agenda and then they ask you, well, what should we do then? And the answer is, it's not for me to tell you what you should be doing about it. I can tell you what's going on. It's up to you to decide if and what you feel that you need to be doing about it, says Lawrence. That's pretty astute, that. I agree with that. Polly was on to say, how you doing, Polly? When they see you doing something against their plan to get rid of you, she's referring to JFK. A lot of comment tonight about JFK taking on the Federal Reserve. Which, of course, Woodrow Wilson famously said was the most disastrous thing that he ever did in his political career, which was hand the money supply over to a bunch of private bankers. Incredible when you think, looking back on it. Loads of comments on this. People are absolutely riveted by Don. I'll tell you more about the book in a couple of minutes' time. What was the payoff then for the people behind bringing down the Oklahoma building and killing all those people? What was their payoff?
Well, I think we saw immediately Bill Clinton's, I believe his popularity went up, but he made a couple of emotion-laden speeches. President Obama was very good at that too. But Bill Clinton could exploit a tragedy better than anyone. He could take a little handicapped child out and prop her up on the desk and, take credit for, feeling sorry for her. I feel your pain, as he used to say. And so that's what he did here. He basically sympathized with the families, as, who wouldn't? But, and of course, the fact that I believe that having all those children there in the daycare center really struck an emotional chord and made the impact even greater with Americans. And from that moment on, you didn't hear very much more about the militia.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Ross Perot ran again in 1996, but I think he got like 8% of the vote. And the third party movement really, at that time they had term limits. All these things were coming up that were drastically needed reforms. And that all kind of died with Oklahoma City. It really did, because as you mentioned, the general impression left in the public mind was that, see what happens when these crazy wackos go too far. They got upset about Waco. They got upset about Ruby Ridge, and then went and blew up a daycare center and killed all these kids. And McVeigh was never interviewed. He didn't, and McVeigh was very curious in his behavior. And then I don't accept for a minute that he said those awful things about, collateral damage and all that stuff. And he kept score that, he killed more people and so forth. He supposedly said this right near the end before they very quickly executed him, to these two authors that wrote a sensationalist book that was published, I believe, posthumously after he died. And I don't believe he said those awful things, because he really didn't say much about anything, which was very curious. And like I said, I think the evidence against him was full of holes, and he was involved in some way, a little different than Oswald was perhaps, but certainly we know there was a much larger story there. And I go to it in detail in the book, but it was an important event because it really set back the anti-establishment, third party, whatever you want to call it, movement.
He might as well. He might have been part of one of these drills without knowing what was really going on. We can't discount that, so we can't. That there was a drill, and that because of his service record, that somebody might have said to him, "Hey Tim, do you want to make a few bucks? We're going to do a drill. We're going to simulate an attack on a building." Now, when I've said that to people, a lot of people said, "No, Richie, that's complete nonsense." But it's not impossible, Don, is it?
No, we find these drills, and one of the, I don't know if it happens in the UK as much, but over here in the US, we have a distressing trend. People can make fun of the people that talk about Sandy Hook and Boston bombing and the actors and so forth. Well, these crisis actors exist. There's a crisisactors.org, and in our schools, they stage these drills way too frequently. Yeah. And they're like mock shootings. They have actors coming in with fake blood playing the victims. Usually they cast the bad shooter that comes in as a irate homeschooler or a gun nut or something that is politically correct the way they want to spin it. It's not some environmentalist that's gone crazy over his support for the Democratic Party or something. It's always politically correct, and And it's on a psychological level. You wonder why they're doing this, but they are doing it in communities, neighborhoods, and like I said, they're doing it in schools, and it's very disturbing. And they're come right out and tell you they have the drills. And most of these events recently, whether it's Sandy Hook, Boston bombing, there were drills happening within around that area at the same time. And so, of course, it's a natural assumption for people to make, especially when there's so many flaws in these official narratives of these events, for people to connect them to the drills.
Never forget, people, never forget that when the 7th of July attacks happened in London, that later on in the day, Peter Power went on Channel 4 News Live or ITV News Live, I should say, independent television news. The clip is on the internet. It isn't a lie. He went on international news and he said, isn't it amazing, while these bombings were going on in London today, carried out by these Muslims, we were running a drill that was simulating the exact same type of attacks in the exact same underground stations. See, and people have to believe that, Don, you know. It's fed to people. You have to believe it. And the news anchor said, oh, that's an amazing coincidence.
Yeah.
Whereas I would have torn him a new one, Don. And I'm no Jeremy Paxman. I'm no Walter Cronkite. I'm certainly not. But I would have said, Peter, hang on a second there. You're going nowhere, and we're going to extend this broadcast by a half an hour. Tell us again, Peter, how you were running the drill today that, by an amazing coincidence, simulated exactly the same set of circumstances as has played out in real life. But no, Don.
And that's you're exactly right. If we just had reporters that did that,
Yeah.
that held these, but that we just don't. They just and I don't think they have to have meetings where they instruct them on what not to ask. I think they're just indoctrinated, and on some kind of subconscious level, they know what not to ask, and they know not to. They immediately know if somebody's questioning authority, it's a conspiracy theory, and that's I don't know how is it a conspiracy theory to question what someone's saying, but somehow they twist that into that. And if we just had real reporters, I mean, can you imagine if I don't know if you watch, or again, I'm not as familiar with your system, but if you watch White House press conferences here, and it doesn't matter which of the parties is in power. The softball questions are embarrassing. I mean, a high school debating team could ask more detailed questions and grill them a little bit more. I mean, it's. Do
you know what's so sinister about that, Don? We all had a good laugh last year when White House press secretary, or one of the press briefers, Jen Psaki, lovely, cute little Jen Psaki, told the assembled press that it's not now and never has been US foreign policy to overthrow governments. And there was a guy, this was all over the independent media, there was a guy who sat there and he said, hang on a second now, ever? And he started saying, well, we could look at we could look at Iran, we could look at Central America. And she laughed and kind of brushed it off. And as I understand it, he's not been at any briefing since. This guy, don't let him in ever again.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's not what they're looking for. Well, in this country, just during my lifetime, and I remark on this quite a bit, it's amazing how the transformation that has taken place in terms of how America, presents itself. Let alone 40 years ago, a night when Gerald Ford, of all people, a Warren Commission member, was president, hardly a bastion of civil libertarianism, he was pressured when they were first starting to expose CIA abuses to sign an executive order that banned assassination as a foreign policy weapon for the United States. And at the time, public polls showed that most people would have been against assassinating Adolf Hitler during World War II because we recognized in the West that assassination was beyond the pale. It was something you didn't do. Well, flash forward to a so-called liberal president, Barack Obama, who assassinates Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen who was not even charged with any crime, who targets him with a drone, brags about it, and then the next month kills his 16-year-old son by coincidence. And we see this all the time. We have Hillary Clinton, we saw he died and all. I mean, these are so-called liberals that are bragging about killing people. So how far have we gone downhill in 40 years, where 40 years ago we wouldn't have even assassinated Hitler. But now, 40 years later, anybody's fair game as long as he's perceived to be, with the terrorists, whoever they are. And that's just an awful aspect that has happened, especially after 9/11. where, things just, when you have an enemy that really can't be identified, can be anywhere and everywhere at the same time, could be anybody pretty much named Muhammad, I guess. It's just, it's very hard to fight that kind of enemy or if you can't identify him. So it's this war on terrorism, really, and that's why with the presidential candidates we have now, I mean, for instance, Bernie Sanders, he says a lot of good things, but he buys into the war on terror. He's all for it, and so I can't support anybody that's buys into this nonsense and wants to keep infringing our civil liberties.
And you just described the Emmanuel Goldstein situation, didn't you? The hidden enemies at, and you know these overseas assassinations like you described, I can never say it, Malaki. It's only a matter of time, Don, before some guy is in Birmingham and they don't like what he's doing or what he's saying, so he's taken out. It could be Birmingham, Alabama, or it could be Birmingham, United Kingdom. He was a terrorist, and we had to kill him, folks.
The precedent has been set, and that's when you take that step, when you start. Whether even something. I'm a strong opponent of capital punishment, if you can tell by the book. Most of my citizens, most of my fellow citizens, unfortunately support it. But once you start giving the state that kind of power, certainly all right wingers should oppose it. They don't want to give the state power, and you want to give them the power over life and death. But as you said, once we have this drone technology, and you have the president of the United States spiking the football over killing somebody, and you're right. Eventually, it could be somebody within the United States that they target, and all they have to do at this point is just say he was working with the terrorists, and the public is apparently satisfied with that, and the mainstream media is certainly going to be satisfied.
Well, they're not going to ask for any proof. It's like the head of Europol said the other day, that there's evidence. Wainwright's the guy's name, from Europol. He said there's all sorts of evidence that ISIS are planning massive attacks in Europe. Not a single member of the assembled press asked him to provide any proof, Don. I'll give you the last word, my friend, because we're rapidly going to run out of time. I'll give you the last 30 seconds. But just before I do that, though, before Don has the final word, folks, do yourself a favour. Go on to online book retailers like Amazon. Check out Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies and cover-ups in American politics. Written by our guest this hour, Don Jeffries. It's brilliant, and it'll be a terrific read. Don, I'll give you the final word, my friend. Really enjoyed having you on.
Well, thanks so much for having me and giving me this opportunity. I hope everyone will read my book and read books like it. I hope they will continue to listen to shows like yours, and there's lots of others out there like that. Go for, ask questions, be skeptical, be your own media, like We Are Change and so many of the other groups. There is a media out there forming, and it's the people. You ask the questions. If the professionals aren't going to do it, then, just look at the YouTube videos. And there's people in their parents' basements that are documenting events that the professional journalists aren't. They're dissecting them. They're disproving them. They're asking the questions that journalists don't. So always question things. Don't be afraid of being a conspiracy theorist. You're not. You're just you're questioning authority, which you should do if you want to be free.
Don, do us a favour. Don't be a stranger to the programme. Stay in touch with us. It'd be great to have you back on again.
Anytime. I'd be happy to be back on, Richie. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on, Don. That was lovely.